Hi. Chapter 5, called the BFG. The giant picked up the trembling Sophie with one hand and carried her across the cave and put her on the table. Now he is really going to eat me, Sophie thought. The giant sat down and stared hard at Sophie. He had truly enormous ears. Each one was as big as the wheel of a truck, and he seemed to be able to move them inwards and outwards from his head as he wished. "I is hungry," the giant boomed. He grinned, showing his massive square teeth. The teeth were very white and very square, and they sat in his mouth like huge slices of white bread. Please don't eat me," Sophie stammered. The giant let out a bellow of a laugh. "Ha! Just because I is a giant, you think I is a man-gobbling cannibal?" he shouted. "You is about right. Giants is all cannibally and murderful, and they does gobble up human beings. We is in giant country now. Giants is everywhere around. Out there us has the famous bone-crunching giant. Bone-crunching giant crunches up 2 wopsy whiffling human beings for supper every night. Noise is ear-bursting. Noise of crunching bones goes crackety-crack for miles around." "Ouch," Sophie said. "Bone-crunching giant only gobbles human beings from Turkey," the giant said. "Every night, bone-crunching giant is galloping off to Turkey to gobble Turks." Sophie's sense of patriotism was suddenly so bruised by this remark that she suddenly became quite angry. "Why Turks?" she blurted out. "What's wrong with the English?" "Bone-crunching giant says Turks is tasting ever so much juicier and more scrumdiddly-umptious. Bone Cruncher says Turkish human beings has a glamourly flavor. He says Turks from Turkey is tasting of turkey." "Well, I suppose they would," Sophie said. "Of course they would," the giant shouted. "Every human being is diddly and different. Some is scrumdiddly-umptious, and some is ucky-slush. Greeks is all full of ucky-slush. No giant is eating Greeks, ever." "Why not?" Sophie asked. "Greeks from Greece is tasting all greasy," the giant said. "I imagine that's possible, too," Sophie said. She was wondering with a bit of a tremble what all this talking about eating people was leading up to. Whatever happened, she simply must play along with this peculiar giant and smile at all his jokes. But were they jokes? Perhaps the great brute was just working up an appetite by talking about food. "As I am saying," the giant went on, "all human beings is having different flavors. Human beings from Panama is tasting very much strongly of hats." "Why hats?" Sophie said. "You is not very clever," the giant said, moving his great ears in and out. "I thought all human beings is full of brains, but your head is emptier than a bundongle." Do you like vegetables?" Sophie asked, hoping to steer the conversation towards a slightly less dangerous kind of food. "You is trying to change the subject," the giant said sternly. "We is having an interesting babblement about the taste of a human being. The human being is not a vegetable." "Oh, but a bean is a vegetable," Sophie said. "Not a human being," the giant said. "The human being has 2 legs and the vegetable has no legs at all." Sophie didn't argue anymore. The last thing she wanted to do was make this giant cross. "The human being," the giant went on, "is coming in dillions of different flavors. For instance, human beings from Wales is tasting very whooshy like fish. There is something very fishy about Wales." You mean Wales?" Sophie said. "Wales is something quite different." "Wales is Wales," the giant said. "Don't gobble funk around with words. I will now give you another example. Human beings from Jersey has a most disgustable woolly tickle on your tongue," the giant said. "Human beings from Jersey is tasting of cardigans." "You mean like jerseys, like sweaters?" Sophie said. "You are once again gobble funking," the giant shouted. "Don't do it. This is a serious and snitching subject. May I continue?" "Yes, please do so," Sophie said. "Danes from Denmark is tasting ever so much like dogs," the giant went on. "Oh, of course," said Sophie. "The taste of Great Danes." "Wrong!" cried the giant, slapping his thigh. "Danes from Denmark is tasting doggy because they is tasting of Labradors." "Then what do people of Labrador taste of?" Sophie asked. "Danes!" the giant cried triumphantly. "Great Danes!" "Aren't you getting a bit mixed up?" Sophie said. "I is a very mixed up giant," the giant said, "but I does do my best, and I is not nearly as mixed up as other giants. I know one who gobbles and gallops all the way to Wellington for his supper." "Wellington?" Sophie said. "Where's Wellington?" "Oh, your head is full of squashed flies," the giant said. "Wellington is in New Zealand. The human being in Wellington has an especially scrumdiddlyumptious taste. So says the well-eating giant." "So what do the people of Wellington taste of?" Sophie asked. "Boots," the giant said. "Oh, of course," said Sophie. "I should have known." Sophie decided that this conversation had now gone on long enough. If she was going to be eaten, she'd rather get it over and done with right away than be kept hanging around for any more time. "Well, what sort of human beings do you eat?" she asked, trembling. "Me?" shouted the giant, his mighty voice making the glass jars rattle on their shelves. "Me gobbling up human beings? This I never. The others, yes. All the others is gobbling them up every night, but not me. I is a freaky giant. I is a nice and jumbly giant. I is the only nice and jumbly giant in giant country. I is the big friendly giant. I is the BFG. What is your name?" "My name is Sophie," Sophie said, hardly daring to believe the good news she just heard. Here's a little picture of the size. You can see of the giant and the 12-foot table with Sophie on top. Huge giant ears, right? So there we go, and we'll come back next day, tomorrow, with the new chapter called The Giants. See you later.